My parents used to tell me if you have one or two good teachers through your high school years, you're doing really well. And one of them, I think, is Gerry Chidiac on the other side of the screen. I just get that impression from reading his material and talking to him briefly. Welcome, Gerry.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Alan. I'm glad to be here.
Now, I've got to tell viewers that the reason you're here, why would I single out a high school teacher from Prince George, British Columbia? Well, you're multilingual, multi talented, teach social justice, have a perspective on residential schools, and I want to tap into that. Please tell me, in the tragedy of recent weeks of finding mass graves of children at residential schools. How have you dealt with that with your high school students? They must have wanted your opinion the instant you walked in the room.
Actually, we were asked to talk to our students about that. And the way that I addressed the issue was basically to be honest, right? Like truth, always seek truth. That's really one of the keys to education. And quite honestly, I wasn't surprised that those were found. Um, when we see the conditions in the residential schools, that's not surprising. I told my students about what Dr. Bryce had discovered in 1907, that, the health conditions were atrocious in the residential schools. And he came with a plan and he said, okay, if we do this, we will reduce the number of deaths, like 25% on average. We're dying from tuberculosis, and that's only tuberculosis, right? There were a number of other factors as well. They were miserable places. So the way that I addressed the issue was to talk about that and talk about the fact that the Canadian government had the opportunity to fix the problem, and they chose not to, right? Duncan Campbell Scott said, no, we're not doing that. He told Dr. Bryce, and Dr. Bryce got sidelined and, basically pushed into retirement. So the way that I address the issue is that in our school, have you ever heard of Project of Heart? It is a national, okay, it's a national movement to basically teach the kids and basically memorialize those who suffered in the residential schools, to recognize, it's one of the 94 calls to action, actually, to have a memorial for the people who were lost and the people who suffered in the residential schools. So in 2014, 2015, in our school, Duchess Park, one of the Aboriginal education workers, was Candace George was her name. She's working with the Wet'suwet'en community now. She's no longer with our school district, unfortunately, but she was a person who loved her so much. And she led a project of Heart in the school, where they talked about the residential schools with the students. So the way the issue was addressed in our school, Project of Heart, an Aboriginal education worker in 2014. Her name's Candace George, brilliant Indigenous leader. She was working for the school district at the time. And so with Project of Heart, they taught the kids in the school about what happened in the residential schools, right? Asking students, what school did you go to? And then asking, for example, did your school have a graveyard? And that was a residential school survivor who told that story and said, well, my school had a graveyard, and this is why. And that was sort of the, teaching the kids about what happened. And then the students, there's different aspects of this piece of art. It's an absolutely beautiful work of art that's put together. It's done on a moose hide, and Candace and some of the students actually tanned the moose hide and tied it onto a log frame, and it's now in a glass case in our entryway. So I brought the students to that, And I talked to them about the significance of that piece of art. Because sometimes when a piece of art is in your school, in your building, you walk past it every
Mm.
day and you don't realize what it is. And so we talked about what that is. And I said, that's the memorial to those who died and those who suffered, and those who survived the residential schools. And that's why it's here, and it's an important piece of our school. And that's how I, you know, address the issue with my students.
Now, you
Mhm.
mentioned a few people from history, Duncan Campbell Scott and others. Can you just set the stage and name the players, please?
Sure, sure. Another part that I did was, you know, basically tell my students the truth about what happened, and that it wasn't surprising that 215 children were found. Um, in 1907, I believe it was, the Department of Indian Affairs, it was as it was then called, assigned a brilliant, actually, doctor who's a leader in public health, um, Dr. Peter Bryce, to look at the schools and find out why more children were dying in those schools, because tuberculosis, as you know, was rampant at the turn of the 20th century and for a number of years after. And so he looked at the schools and he said, well, the reason why kids are dying has nothing to do with the fact that they're Indigenous. The reason why they're dying is because the conditions in these schools are creating tuberculosis factories. So we need to make these changes, and then we won't have that happening anymore. And he went to his boss, Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the head of the department, I suppose. He wasn't the minister, but high up there in the government in that department. And he said, okay, this is what we need to do. And this is what it will cost. And Duncan Campbell Scott said, no, we're not doing that. So it's not surprising that, you know, bodies were found. And tuberculosis, let's be honest, is only one of the factors that these kids face in these schools. You know, and and it's important to talk about these, you know, the residential schools, because it impacts our community of Prince George very much. We have a large Indigenous population in our community. But not only that, it's part of the history of Canada. And we need to, you know, to get back to how we deal with this. The seven sacred teachings, the seven grandfather teachings from our Indigenous elders are the perfect way to teach about what to do. You know, you seek truth, right? And what's the truth? And the beautiful thing about truth is no matter how powerful people try to bury the truth, it always comes to the surface. And you know, this is a perfect example of that. Those bodies, they haven't come to the surface, but the fact that they are there has come to the surface. You know, it's metaphorical, yes, but it's also a basic principle that we know. And you know, when I teach social justice, that's one of the things that always comes out, that crimes against humanity happen. Powerful people try to cover it up. Even not so powerful people try to cover it up, but truth always comes to the surface. So let's seek truth,
Well,
right?
now, Gerry, let's define terms, because the term crime against humanity was invented by the Americans so they could hold a trial at Nuremberg, because what was done in Germany was perfectly legal. So they had
Right.
to invent a new
Yeah.
law.
Right.
Let's stick with the lots of laws that were broken in Canada. And I'm thinking of, for example, involuntary confinement,
Right.
kidnapping, um, uh, the assault, numerous other laws were broken, and they were broken by people who were wearing police uniforms, and they were broken by people who were wearing clerical robes. Had those people not been wearing those outfits, they would have been hunted down, jailed, denounced from the pulpit, and so on. And those crimes do also reach the threshold of the international definition of genocide, would you say?
Right. Correct. Absolutely. Now, The one thing I would say though, and this goes with Nazi Germany as well, what they were doing was perfectly legal according to the laws of their country, right? They went against moral laws, absolutely. And, I think we need to go back to Raphael Lemkin, who was the fellow he was a Polish Jewish lawyer who defined the term genocide. And he drew primarily from the Armenian genocide and from the Nazi Holocaust in defining that term. But it actually goes much broader, right? And the funny thing is, when we're talking about the residential schools, yes, it was genocide. Because if you look at the 1948 definition of the crime of genocide, the Genocide Convention from the United Nations, it does meet those conditions, forcibly removing children from their home, conditions of living that were going to bring about harm, right, and so on. Though it meets that definition, but the definition didn't exist yet. What's interesting, what I also bring up with my students though, is that when that was being discussed in the 1940s in the United Nations, Canada was not super gung-ho about the definition, right? And I asked the students, why do you think that was? And they're like, well, we have residential schools. We had residential schools operating at that time. And yeah, that's why. Or that's what I would assume why. I don't know if that's written down anywhere, but I think that's a pretty safe assumption.
Well, Gerry, that's one of the reasons I mentioned the more pedestrian laws of kidnapping and assault and so on, failure to provide the necessities of life, because those laws predate the genocide laws, and it's very difficult in the time-space continuum to hold people in history responsible for laws, morals, ethics that existed 100 years after they did their dastardly deeds.
Right.
Um,
There are also moral laws too, right? There are also, and for somebody, for example, for a Christian, for example, to say, I follow the teachings of Christ, and the teachings of Christ are beautiful, right? I love the teachings of Christ, that you love your neighbor, right? That every person is a sacred child of God in the eyes of Jesus. When you're, mistreating an entire culture, when you're mistreating a child, you're not recognizing those higher moral teachings, right? So, yeah, so go ahead.
Gerry, I have Exhibit A here, and this is a wonderful both hockey book, personal story, and a story of the residential schools. It is Fred Sasakamoose from Saskatchewan, where I used to live. And I have said before, the book kind of sneaks up on you. You think you're going to read mainly about hockey, but you also read about the residential schools. The thing that I noticed was that they couldn't even be competent at running a school. Whatever other dastardly deeds they did, they didn't feed the kids. The kids were essentially forced labor, milking cows and tending to crops and so on. And sure, there was one priest who got Fred Sasakamoose into hockey, but also someone else who handed out straps and wanted him to beat his fellow students, I guess because the priest couldn't be bothered to do his own dirty work. So the thing that annoys me, it can't possibly be equally, but the thing that I think is writ large is they weren't even competent educators. What
Right,
do you say
right.
about that as a teacher?
Well, part of the problem was that they were grossly underfunded, right?
Well, they had
And
bricks and mortar. They had, Gerry, they had bricks and mortar, and they
yeah,
had food for the priests. And a
yeah,
brick and mortar construction in the middle of the bald prairie was not cheap 100 years ago. So they had money
yeah,
for some things.
yeah. They did have money for some things, and there we'd have to look at the Canadian government, I think, um, because the money just wasn't there. There's a wonderful book um, that I read with my students. It's called Stony Creek Woman. I don't have a copy of it here. Stony Creek Woman by Mary John, who is from Stony Creek is about 100 kilometers from Prince George. And she was actually born, she was born Lake Tenay. She's from our territory here. And I forgot to mention we're on the unceded ancestral territory of the Lake Tenay. That's where I'm speaking. And I say that with great gratitude to the Lake Tenay for this beautiful, wonderful place that we live and call call our home. But no, they were grossly underfunded, and that goes back to sort of what Duncan Campbell Scott was dealing with as well. The Canadian government was not willing to fund them. What's disturbing to me, Allan, is, and I'm not trying to avoid your question, but that problem continues today, right? If you listen to Dr. Cindy Blackstock, she talks about that quite a bit. She's at McGill. She's a professor at McGill. The funding that we give to students on for not just for education, but for all services for Indigenous children living on reserve is 1/3 to 1/2 of what a student would get, for example, in a school like mine.
Well, and
You
let
know,
me underscore that, Gerry, because some people might watch and think, oh, well, that's the luck of the draw. They're in, a remote area or whatever. But this is a constitutional, legal treaty and honor of the crown requirement. It seems to me
yes.
there may be some exceptions, but for the most part, it's that proper and codified a requirement. And I've got a little theory for you. I'm not a scholar of this the way you are, but I have a little theory for you. The Indian Act and many treaties anticipated education as a requirement for the government to provide education to Indigenous groups. They didn't. The churches then stepped in to deliver it. No doubt some people were decent people, not monsters, trying to do the right thing, give young kids an education, 3 squares a day, that type of simplistic view. But the government then funded a bit. But had the government done its duty, perhaps the churches wouldn't have been involved and we would have had better schools. What do you think of that?
Well, studying the historical documents, of course, that would have been better, but studying the historical documents, there was so much racism and paternalism that, I don't see that in the documents. I think the Mohawk had some ideas, like the Mohawk, like Brant and the others. I don't know, maybe. I think. Well, quite honestly, we should have listened to the Indigenous elders all along, and we need to listen to them today, right? Really, I think that's really what it's a question of ethnocentrism. It's a question of not respecting. It's a question of not listening. And when you do things like that, bad things happen. When you don't respect people, right, and you make decisions for them, that's that paternalism. But what I'm saying is the point I'm making is we're still doing it, right? We're still doing it. Like according to the BNA Act, schools are a provincial jurisdiction, right? So British Columbia funds our schools. And I have to say, I'm very proud of the education that we provide to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students in our school. Not to say that we're perfect. We have a long, long, long way to go. Our graduation rates for our Indigenous students are still much too low. And so we have a lot of work to do, right? But we're trying to make it better. But the federal government has, since the BNA Act, been responsible for education on reserves, right? And they grossly underfund services for people on reserves, especially for children. And it's not just in education; it's in other social services, it's in medical services. It's actually criminal the way that we are to this day dealing with people on the reserve. So it's very nice to point out, we did these bad things in the past and we're trying to reconcile. But part of the reconciliation, quite honestly, is doing it better now.
Yeah, stop
Right?
doing it. Stop doing
Yeah,
the bad stuff. Uh,
yeah.
Gerry,
So
you
yeah,
have a personal experience with this, though. You taught in a Roman Catholic school that had Indian students. Let me not try to tell your story. Please tell your story about your personal involvement.
Yeah. Well, now this is where I want to get more information, quite honestly. And in one of my recent columns, I wrote about Bishop Fergus O'Grady of Prince George. He became Bishop of Prince George in 1956. I knew him personally. I moved to Prince George in 1985 when he was just retiring as bishop. And I'd like to know if, like, looking back, did I do the right thing, right? Because what O'Grady did, and this is what he told me, he said, you know, when I became bishop, I went around the diocese. Now, remember, when he became bishop, he was principal, and this is where the Kamloops thing really bothers me a great deal. He was principal of Kamloops Residential School in the late 1940s, right? So he had to have known about what was happening there, and that's deeply disturbing to me. Um, and and also when he became Bishop of Prince George, the Lejac Residential School, which is about 120 kilometers west of Prince George, was in operation. That's where Mary John, who I mentioned earlier, had gone to school. Now, when O'Grady became Bishop of Prince George, he told me that he went all around the diocese and he asked people what they wanted, and they all told him that they wanted schools. In Mary John's book, she talks about how they were always asking the Indian agent and asking the church for a school in the community. So I don't know if Mary John talked to Fergus O'Grady. I assume that she would have in asking for schools. So what O'Grady did was he took a different approach. He used the money from from Indigenous Affairs or Northern Affairs. He used that money. He used volunteers and support from the local community. He used tuition from non-Indigenous students, and he brought over thousands of volunteers called Frontier Apostles in, really from 1956. The last one left in, I think, 1993. I was one of those people. And I worked for my first 2 years at a Catholic school that he built in Prince George. We didn't have a very large Indigenous population. We had a few, but it wasn't one of the schools that had the larger Indigenous population. It wasn't near a reserve. But the high school in Prince George was the Catholic high school, which was at that time called Prince George College. They had residences for the Indigenous and a few non-Indigenous, but the vast majority were Indigenous students from all over the north. So they lived there, and but they were, O'Grady would go and have meals with them, with the kids. There wasn't that separation that there was in the residential school. So I don't know.
Did you hear stories? Did you have suspicions, or did you have experiences that you can share?
Well, not a lot. Like I know that, for example, well, here's a couple things I do know. Back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, we did not screen people the way that we do now, right? So were there volunteers who came who were not good people and who mistreated the kids? I'm sure there were. That was the whole Furlong case in with the Vancouver Olympics, right? He was a Frontier Apostle, John Furlong. And so things came out about that. I don't know what came as final from that case, but that, there were there people who mistreated the kids who were Frontier Apostles. I would have a hard time saying that there weren't, right?
Gerry, I also have to raise I think a kind of a challenging or an uncomfortable question that is more general. I don't want to lose the focus and spotlight on residential schools, but I think you've touched on something about qualifications. And
Right.
I went through the education faculty as well, but it was, after the era you're talking about, 50s, 60s. 70s, really. But I put this to you. I think a lot of people went into education because they wanted to push around smaller people or bully people. And I think that's a very unkind thing to say about the profession of teaching, because the good couple of teachers that you have in your career are so important to you. But I think there was that. What do you think? Is that too harsh?
Um, I would have a really hard time commenting on that. I can say that the community of teachers that I work with are exceptional people. We have a really wonderful education community that I work with. And I really like the time that I'm able to collaborate with my colleagues. What was in the past, I don't know if that was pedagogical theory. Like I often talk to my students. Actually, I do talk to my students about that. I can't talk about any individuals or in general, but why, but I do, like at the beginning of every course I teach, I do come up with rules and consequences with my students, right? And I said, primarily, the key point is respect. How are we going to create a respectful environment in this classroom? What rules do we need to create an environment of respect? And I do say to the kids that that respect is not just you toward me, that's me toward you and you toward each other, right? And I do tell them that back in the day, I don't know why they would have thought that smacking a kid with a ruler would be good education. Because what you do is you create fear.
Mhm.
And what that does, it shuts a person down. And so they're no longer open to learning,
Well, Gerry, that's
right?
exactly the example I was going to use. My mother, who was left-handed, told me of stories in a Protestant school of being smacked on a ruler for using her left hand. Uh,
Yeah,
and I was the recipient of corporal punishment a couple of times. And when I was in the Faculty of Education, there was someone, actually, it was an older man from normal school, but he was teaching in the Faculty of Education. He said, all students deserve a pat on the back, some high, some low. Now, it had some, in a way, sick humor to it. None of us thought much about it. But today, that would be actionable and completely unacceptable behavior.
right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, like I say, that is, it's not even good pedagogy, right? You don't learn when you're afraid. You have to feel respected. You have to feel comfortable. You have to, you know, you have to, um, yeah, it's, you have to feel respected in order to learn.
Gerry, we were also talking about the lack of funding for the school, that the schools didn't even have enough food to eat for the kids, that sort of thing. And yet, at the time, the Roman Catholic Church was a very wealthy organization. They probably owned the land, for example, in Montreal, where Westmount Square was built, a Mies van der Rohe building. So they huge real estate empire, lots of money, but not
Right.
for the kids, ironically and tragically.
Yeah. Well, again, in that case, O'Grady again is an exception, actually. Um, I don't know how he did it. Like that's the thing. I'd like to know the record on this. But he bought up tracts of land in Prince George in the late 50s and early 60s, and he developed it. And the money that he made in developing the land was put into the schools and to build schools and churches and fund schools. Um, and I so in that case it was a little bit different during his time. So that's the thing. There's calls like calls for people, in Prince George to change the name of O'Grady Road, right, named after Bishop O'Grady, and for UBC to rescind his honorary doctorate. And maybe we will need to do that, right? Maybe there are skeletons in Fergus O'Grady's closet, but uh, um, we need to do a lot of research. We need to talk, look at the records, and we need to talk to the Indigenous people who were around at that time.
Right.
And, what's the legacy of Fergus O'Grady? Because I can say that for me, I loved working for the guy. I really did. He was like, he was like a grandfather. I had him talk to my students, and he always made them laugh, and and he enjoyed being with them. He was a very grandfatherly person, but quite honestly, Alan, I think this is one of the reasons why I'm a good teacher is because I'm a terrible judge of character. I like everybody, um, so I really do. I
Well,
like everybody,
Gerry,
and
if we're going to
yeah,
raise the occasional eccentric teacher, dedicated person, and wonderful fundraiser, we have to give honorable mention to Father Athol Murray from Notre Dame in Saskatchewan, Wilcox, Saskatchewan, long gone.
yeah,
But
yeah.
he was a living memory, if not actually alive, when I lived in Saskatchewan. And there is a story, and I think it's Fred Saskatchewan's book, where he walks into Athol Murray's office and he's smoking a cigar and he's got a glass of whiskey in his hand. And there are stories in Saskatchewan where he would raise money, um, essentially by strong arming wealthy people. And anyway, he was a real character. And I don't know whether anything dastardly happened in Wilcox, but his successor, I believe, was Jason Kenney's father. And that's where Jason Kenney grew up. Perhaps I digress. Gerry, I have another philosophical question for you about education, which is going to lead up to what do you do in the social justice class. There are a lot of fads in education. And for those of a certain age, maybe even you might remember John Young's free school in Campbell River, British Columbia. This was a principal who felt that if kids were going to be, out at night and maybe even drinking, maybe even doing drugs, they should have a safe place to go. So he kept the library open 24 hours a day. Kind of an interesting approach. And I went to a school based on that, Alpha Secondary School in Burnaby. The curriculum in those days was reading a particular book. If you were going to read about ethics or economics or something, it might be through The Merchant of Venice, or it might be through you might read about the environment through a poem by W. Ross, If Ice, perhaps, if I've got the name of that right, and Love, the great John Donne's Valediction Forbidding Morning. Today, the curriculum is more about values and words that symbolize something good. It isn't about particular works of literature or poetry or drama. Am I correct?
Yes, we're given a lot more. The new BC curriculum, it gives us a lot of leeway, as a lot of professional leeway. Yeah.
And hence, in many classrooms, more collages and more popular recent literature and the expunging of Shakespeare and Donne and Milton and others. Well, that's a whole other big debate. You now have a course called Social Justice. Now, I don't know whether you could read Emile Zola's Germinal about mine workers. You could read the Molly Maguires. What do you teach in social justice?
Well, one thing I would say, just for to come to the defense of my English teaching colleagues, they do still study Shakespeare,
Ah,
right? Um, you know, but there's what right now what we're doing is we're challenged to present it in a way that's accessible to everyone, right? And there are a lot of creative ways to do that, right? So no, but my colleagues in the English department, they're, like I say, they're exceptional and do a really good job, and the kids do get excited about Shakespeare. I have a hard time getting excited about Shakespeare. But going back to social justice, there's um, one of the things that I do is one of the books that I read with my students every year is Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl. Are you familiar with that?
I know
Uh,
his name, but I've not read that book.
okay, it is a fabulous book. He was a Jewish psychiatrist in Vienna, and he lost his family in the Holocaust. And basically, he quotes a lot from Nietzsche, that a person who has a why can deal with any how. A lot of people, when they when they're dealing with proactivity, will look at Frankel's book, Stephen Covey, in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, draws from Viktor Frankl, a wonderful, wonderful human being, actually. And one of the things he says too is, the best of us didn't return, right? And so he tries to present in a way of not being judgmental toward anyone. It was a horrific time. You look at the facts, right, of what happened, and then look at this amazing work of psychiatry. Logotherapy is what it is, finding meaning in the book, and that's what he found. If a person was going to survive, all things being equal, one had to have meaning, right? And if you look, for example, at Elie Wiesel's book, another book that we've read that I don't always read, but his book Night, which is really a classic piece of Holocaust literature as well. He and his father were in the concentration camp together, and they survived really because they were each surviving for the other. Right now, Wiesel ended up losing his father near the end of the war, during the Buchenwald death march, unfortunately. But it's that same idea, finding meaning, finding someone, something to live for. And Frankel's book is beautiful. And one of the things he says is that suffering is like gas in a vacuum, that no matter how much or how little of it there is, it fills the room. So that, people in our culture can relate to it because people still suffer, right? And one of the things, actually, I heard in an interview with Frankel's grandson, actually, and he said one of the things my grandfather used to say is everybody has their own Auschwitz. We all deal with our own challenges in life, and I think it's important for the kids to hear that, because they're going through a lot too, right? They go through difficult times. It's not easy being a teenager, even though we have so much. It's not easy. And if we can find meaning, something important to do, then life becomes so much better. So when I teach social justice, it is in that whole idea of finding meaning, that what I tell the kids is you're a gift to the world. Who you are is a gift to the world, and so is your neighbor, and so is everyone else, and so are the people who are suffering in Yemen right now. Each of them is a gift to the world. What can we do to make the world a better place? That's sort of the approach that I take with social justice.
Well, the two things come to my mind, Gerry, and you can see what a pain in the neck I'd be, and I was in class. But one is, those are moving books and moving accounts, and horrific accounts sometimes. But how do you make the bridge from the fact that there is evil done in the world to the promotion of social justice? I missed that bridge.
Okay. Well, you're part of the solution. Each of us is part of the solution, right?
Well,
And
that's the missing bridge. That these things are so horrific, we must all individually do something about them.
yeah. And I often quote Dr. King, the arc of the moral, well, he quoted somebody else with it, but the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, right? And so, I say to the kids, I've been involved in social justice for, since I was 18 years old, for the last 40 years. And I've seen a lot of good things happen. Don't doubt the significance of every small act, right? I'll give you an example. We have one of the custodians that I work with is he's from El Salvador, right? And his family came as refugees from El Salvador around 1990. And the El Salvador, the Civil War in El Salvador was one of the first social justice issues that I got involved in, right? And I remember writing many letters to Michael Wilson, who was my member of parliament, Etobicoke Center, where I grew up. I wrote many letters to him about this. And it was when I put two and two together, Joe Clark was the um, foreign affairs minister under Mulroney, right? Joe Clark was a pretty social justice oriented person. He did a lot of really, like he like Canada was one of the first countries to object to apartheid, right? But anyhow, I say to the guy, like, I don't know if what I did has anything to do with my friend Juan working with me right now in Prince George, but maybe it did, right? Because I took a stand on that, and Clark and Mulroney really challenged the Americans who were, funding the war in El Salvador, challenged them by allowing refugees from El Salvador to come to Canada. Part of the reason why I think they did that was because people were standing up and saying, this is not okay, right? So don't doubt what those small acts can do to make the world a better place.
Okay, fair enough. So you are advocating engagement and action, however small or large. Let me put one other thing to you, that as I age, I am less interested in the concept of social justice, corporate social responsibility in corporations, and other such, forgive me, squishy concepts. I want a law. I mean, in Brown versus Board of Education in the United States, which desegregated schools, did we really want, a talking circle or a negotiated settlement or what have you? I think we are often better off with a hard and fast law that prohibits certain dastardly behavior, because
Right.
there is racism, there were genocidal acts, but there's also just plain stupidity and insensitivity, and the remedies are different, and sometimes you just can't convince somebody. You have to say, this will be illegal if you do it, you will be charged, you might go to jail, so knock
Right.
that off.
Right. And you need that. Absolutely. There are, like most people, I would say, well into the 90s of percent of people are really good and want to make the world a better place. But you do have people who don't care about other people, who are very egocentric, who are, who don't care. And we do need to hold them accountable. And we talk about the International Criminal Court, which is very important. And the International Criminal Court has made a difference. But, and I do say to the students this, that why is it that most of the people who are going to the International Criminal Court are Africans? What about the people from powerful countries, wealthy countries, who are committing crimes against humanity? Why aren't they being held accountable, right? And why aren't these corporate, tech giants being held accountable for, disseminating hate speech, basically?
Gerry, I must have omitted an important question. I'm not as studied as you are in the topic. Do you have any last words for us?
No, just thank you very much for what you're doing. And I was going to ask you about your work in advocating for Indigenous rights as well as a lobbyist. I think that's quite exciting. What do you do with that?
Well, I don't do enough. I do what I can. It was a favorite cause of my brothers in my youth, Indigenous issues, for whatever reason. And when there were fundraisers at school for the Red Feather and the Red Cross, and in those days before United Way, there were numerous causes. He'd always take in his nickel and say, "I want this to go to Indigenous issues," and what he would say, Indians, and just kind of carried on that tradition the best I could.
Yeah, I think what you're doing is really exciting. I really do, because that's, and that's another thing that I say to the students is we all do things differently, right? We're all part of the solution, right? And it takes different people doing all different kinds of things. Um, you know, whatever it is. The key is to be, it's in here. It's our character, right? Of being a kind and compassionate person, one who respects others.
Well, without being argumentative, I also think getting angry about some of these issues has a
Absolutely.
place, you know,
Absolutely.
as does compassion. But as J.D. Salinger wrote in The Catcher in the Rye, you have to decide in life if you're going to get enough education to walk by a sign that says apples, APPLE apostrophe S, which would annoy your colleagues in the English department, and just get mad at it, or are you going to get enough to do something about it? So, one tries. Gerry, we've spent a lot of time, and if you tell your colleagues in the English department who still like teaching Shakespeare, that we've spent so much time together that tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow is going to creep in this petty pace from day to the last syllable of recorded time unless we end the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the discussion. Have an awesome day. Thank you. And thank you to all viewers. Thank you for watching.
Cheers.
All the best.